Beerus arrives not with a whisper but with a vacuum, a pressure that rips the edge off glass and makes satellite feeds scream. And the first thing anyone sees is the city's tallest tower bowing as if in apology. The arrival was staged by Vought International as a spectacle, a seal of legitimacy for an industry that has learned to sell divinity, and they pushed their brightest actors, the Seven, onto a platform framed like a coronation, while Homelander stood at the center with the calm of a man used to being the last word. The air thickened under the weight of observation and cameras, and a single attendant at the edge of the plaza, Wise, watched with the effortless distance of someone who has seen civilizations miscount themselves. Silence opened. Beerus's boredom was the only herald, and when he leaned toward the staged heroes, the world understood that this was not a publicity shoot but a verdict in slow motion, and the first small devastations were only the beginning. Stay with this, and subscribe once if you intend to follow where this judgment leads, because what unfolds from this moment will not be contained to a single rooftop or a single night, and turning away now will not change the consequences already moving toward this world. The first person to collapse wasn't a civilian or a protester outside the barricades, but one of Vought's own camera operators, and the medical team assigned to stand by for overexcited crowd incidents realized too late that their equipment had never been rated for atmospheric pressure that could make bone feel soft. The plaza had been prepared for applause, for flag choreography and drone halos that would frame the Seven against the skyline, but the moment Beerus stepped forward, the rehearsed lighting rigs began to hum as if trying to flee their mounts. The crowd had expected something theatrical, a glow or a thunderclap, but what arrived instead was an indifference so complete that even the wind seemed to hesitate before moving around him. Homelander didn't move at first, and that was by design, because the script had him waiting for the introduction that would frame this entire meeting as a partnership between gods and brands. The PR voiceover began anyway, trembling through speakers calibrated for stadium noise, explaining that Vought had secured an external evaluator to confirm the global necessity of their premier heroes. Somewhere behind Beerus, Wise inclined his head as if acknowledging a performance he had seen many times, though the performers themselves did not yet understand that the audience had never been invited. Queen Maeve shifted her weight, and the movement cracked the polished stone beneath her boots, because the air had changed its mind about how much pressure it was willing to hold. A train blinked twice, and found that the distance between himself and the nearest exit felt longer than it had a moment ago, not because space had stretched, but because Beerus's presence made velocity feel theoretical. Starlight raised her hand slightly, the gesture practiced to signal readiness without aggression, and Vought's handlers in the control tent congratulated themselves on maintaining a posture of calm, even as biometric feeds began to spike into unreadable territory. Beerus glanced across them the way one might glance at furniture, and the passive wash of his kai pressed outward in widening circles that made microphones pop and banners sag toward the ground. He wasn't angry, and that was what made the first effect so difficult to categorize, because irritation has signatures that human analysts understand, while boredom simply erases the need for patience. The edge of the stage gave up its straight lines and softened, not melting exactly but losing conviction, and the closest civilians began to feel their knees loosen, as if gravity had been reminded of alternatives. Homelander stepped forward when the introduction faltered, because silence in front of cameras is a kind of defeat he has never tolerated, and he extended a hand with the casual confidence of someone who believes hierarchy is negotiated in eye contact. The gesture was captured by 50 lenses and 3 orbiting drones, and Vought's media team began drafting headlines that would translate divine inspection into brand partnership. Beerus looked at the offered hand with mild curiosity, as if it were an unexpected utensil, and the delay between that look and any response stretched long enough for the crowd's murmur to acquire an edge. When Homelander's cape brushed Beerus's forearm, It wasn't an attack, but it was contact. And contact was enough to teach the stage that durability is not a promise. The composite material along the platform's lip collapsed into powder with a sound like distant rain, and a shallow wave of dust ran across the plaza in a perfect circle before settling around the feet of heroes who had been marketed as immovable. Homelander's smile held, but the muscles around it tightened as his senses reported a weight that did not correspond to mass, and the handshake he had intended as a demonstration of parity became something he withdrew from a fraction too quickly. Vought's executives began speaking all at once into secured lines, because the narrative had already begun to slip, and narrative control was the only power they had ever exercised reliably. They ordered the seven to begin the demonstration sequence, the one that had been rehearsed for weeks in climate-controlled hangars, where applause could be piped in on command. Starlight fired a contained burst into the sky, sculpting a halo of light above the plaza, while Black Noir executed a silent arc across the stage that would have earned a standing ovation in any other context. Beerus watched the light show as though it were a firefly trapped in a jar, and the chi pressure rolling off him made Starlight's second burst bend sideways before dissipating into nothing. A train attempted a brief acceleration loop meant to carve initials in the air, but the sonic wake faltered, his path collapsing into a stuttering line that ended with him skidding to a stop short of the crowd barrier. Maeve took a step forward to anchor the formation, only to find that the ground under her heel had lost cohesion, pebbles lifting and settling in response to a presence that did not acknowledge them. Somewhere beyond the barricades, the first emergency alerts began to ripple through city infrastructure as pressure sensors registered a storm that had not been forecast, and traffic lights defaulted to red in a pattern that made evacuation a rumor rather than a plan. Government observers in a secure viewing suite began drafting language that would allow for military mobilization without admitting panic, because the term existential was not one they could afford to place in writing. Wise said nothing, his attention on Beerus with the patience of someone who knows that judgment is a process, not a spectacle. Homelander tried again, this time speaking over the sound of the crowd's confusion, framing the moment as collaboration and inviting Beerus to witness their protection protocols in action. The invitation assumed that protection was the metric that mattered, and the assumption hung between them like a challenge neither side had agreed to issue. Beerus's tail flicked once, lazily, and the nearest drone lost altitude as if reminded that lift was optional. The demonstration sequence continued, because stopping would have meant admitting that the script had failed, and Vought had never practiced that contingency. Starlight's light dimmed under the steady pressure, Maeve's stance grew heavier with each breath, and Homelander's eyes began to glow not with performance but with calculation. The first crack in the plaza spread outward beneath them, slow enough to film and fast enough to matter, while the world's most famous heroes realized that the evaluation had already begun, and they had no idea what they were being measured against. The crack beneath the stage did not stop spreading when the cameras cut their public feed, and that was the first sign that this was no longer a controlled event but an unfolding condition. Emergency crews who had been positioned for crowd management found themselves backing away from a widening fault line that ignored architectural logic, because the fracture moved not along stress points but along proximity to Beerus. The stone beneath the seven began to separate into uneven tiers, forcing them to adjust formation in ways that looked less like choreography and more like uncertainty. Inside Vought Tower, executives who had been celebrating the trending metrics of the first 5 minutes now stared at raw telemetry feeds showing localized gravitational distortion. Vought International had planned for backlash, protest, even a rogue supervillain attempting to sabotage the spectacle, but they had not planned for physics itself to lose interest in cooperation. Legal teams began drafting language that would frame any damage as an unforeseeable anomaly, while communications directors rehearsed phrases like temporary instability and external cosmic interference. On the plaza, Homelander felt the shift before anyone else acknowledged it, because authority to him has always been spatial. He is used to occupying the highest point in any room, the visual and emotional apex around which others orbit, and now the ground itself seemed to resist that arrangement. He rose into the air deliberately, cape unfurling in a controlled ascent meant to reclaim visual dominance, but the climb stalled halfway as if the sky had thickened into something resistant. Beerus watched the attempt with mild curiosity, his expression unchanged, and the ambient Chi pressure intensified not as an attack but as a consequence of attention. Windows across the surrounding buildings began to fracture in concentric patterns, and the sound of shattering glass rolled outward like distant thunder. The civilians who had not yet fled felt their ears pop and their balance tilt, and for the first time the crowd's confusion turned into visible fear. Queen Maeve stepped forward again, this time not for optics but because instability demands something solid, and she drove her heel into the fractured stone to anchor herself. The impact sent a ripple through the broken plaza, but instead of stabilizing the surface, it caused the crack to split into branching lines that crawled toward the barricades. A train, breathing harder than he would after a city-block sprint, realized that acceleration required friction, and that friction was no longer reliable under this pressure. From a secure government facility miles away, analysts began to classify Beerus not as a superhuman but as a foreign power, and the distinction changed everything. Military channels opened that had not been used since Cold War simulations, and fighter squadrons were placed on standby under the justification of airspace integrity. Diplomatic teams attempted to establish contact protocols, but every attempt to route communication toward the plaza returned static, as though the signal itself was being judged and found irrelevant. Homelander descended back to the stage with a controlled landing that cracked what remained of the platform, and he addressed Beerus directly, voice amplified through embedded transmitters that had never failed him before. He spoke of protection, of global stability, of being the necessary guardians of a fragile world, and he framed it not as a plea but as a declaration of shared responsibility. The words hung in the air, polished and confident, but they did not seem to register as currency in the space between them. Beerus tilted his head slightly, not in contemplation but in faint irritation, and the shift was enough to send a visible distortion through the air. The nearest skyscraper groaned, steel supports bending just enough to remind everyone watching that scale was no longer comforting. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly in his hand, offering no commentary and no correction, because judgment cannot be coached. Starlight attempted to intervene with something that felt constructive rather than performative, projecting a controlled beam toward the sky to stabilize lighting rigs that were threatening to collapse onto the crowd. The beam flickered mid-projection, diffused by the ambient pressure into a harmless shimmer that dissolved before reaching its target. Her expression shifted from focus to dawning realization as she understood that her power was not being countered, only overshadowed. Inside Vought's command center, a decision was made that would alter the tone of the encounter, escalate the display. They instructed Homelander through a secure channel to demonstrate full-spectrum capability, not as aggression but as proof of indispensability. The calculus was simple and flawed. If Beerus measured civilizations by strength, then overwhelming strength must be persuasive. Homelander's eyes ignited, and twin beams of heat vision carved upward into the sky, slicing through cloud cover in a display designed to impress even orbital observers. The beams did not touch Beerus, but the air around him refracted them into harmless arcs that bent away as if embarrassed. The redirected energy sheared across an unoccupied construction site, collapsing scaffolding in a cascade of steel and dust that sent a shockwave through the surrounding blocks. The unintended destruction changed the atmosphere instantly, because what had been a demonstration was now collateral damage on live global broadcast. Governments that had been hesitating shifted into active posture, and the first fighter jets were scrambled under orders that used the word containment. Vought's stock began to plummet in real time, and the narrative of divine endorsement transformed into one of catastrophic miscalculation. Beerus exhaled softly, not in anger but in annoyance, and the breath alone pushed a visible wave across the plaza that knocked the seven backward several steps. The fractured ground gave way entirely beneath the center of the stage, collapsing into a shallow crater that swallowed lighting rigs and half the branded backdrop. Homelander steadied himself midair, but for the first time the cameras caught something unpracticed in his expression. The recognition that authority was not being challenged, it was being ignored. Above them, the distant roar of approaching jets began to layer over the city's panic, and the military escalation that had been theoretical minutes ago was now physically inbound. Beerus glanced upward, tail flicking again, and the pressure in the air intensified just enough to make the incoming aircraft shudder in their approach. The confrontation had shifted from performance to power, and the fracture in the plaza was only a small preview of the fracture spreading through every institution that had assumed it could manage this moment. By the time the first fighter jets crossed into the city's airspace, the narrative had already begun to fracture faster than the plaza beneath Beerus, because Vought International understood immediately that this was no longer a demonstration of heroism, but a test of liability. Their live broadcast was cut mid-frame and replaced with a pre-approved emergency slate that assured viewers of a temporary environmental anomaly, even as social media filled with raw footage of the seven stumbling against invisible pressure. The company's crisis team pivoted with practiced efficiency, drafting statements that framed Beerus not as a judge, but as an invited consultant whose evaluation was being conducted under strict supervision. Inside the tower, Ashley Barrett's voice moved from shrill panic to procedural clarity as she initiated Containment Protocol 7, a set of policies originally designed for rogue Supes but now repurposed for something they did not have language for. Legal departments coordinated with federal agencies to establish jurisdictional ambiguity, hoping to delay any formal classification of Beerus as a hostile entity. Marketing teams began quietly seeding the phrase cosmic audit across sympathetic outlets, attempting to turn divine scrutiny into an audit they could pass. On the plaza, Homelander watched the incoming jets with a possessiveness that bordered on insult, because airspace had always been his domain. He rose again, not to impress Beerus this time, but to intercept the symbols of a government that suddenly believed it could insert itself into the hierarchy. The pilots received new orders mid-approach, shifting from observation to intimidation passes, and their targeting systems struggled to maintain lock as the ambient Chi pressure distorted range-finding data. Beerus did not acknowledge the aircraft at first, and that absence of response unsettled both sides more than aggression would have. The seven reformed their line out of habit rather than strategy, optics-first behavior asserting itself, even as the ground beneath them continued to settle unevenly. Starlight's comms crackled with Vought directives urging restraint, while Maeve's earpiece carried a separate message from an undisclosed government liaison, requesting situational updates that could be translated into escalation thresholds. Wise remained at the edge of the crater, staff planted lightly against fractured stone, observing with the calm of someone who recognizes that civilizations often misinterpret patience as invitation. The pressure radiating from Beerus intensified in small increments, enough to make the jets' wings tremble as they passed overhead. One pilot reported a sudden loss of lift despite full throttle, and the aircraft dipped alarmingly before recovering, its wake scattering loose debris across the plaza. Vought's media arm deployed a secondary strategy, releasing archival footage of the seven performing disaster relief to reinforce their indispensability in the public mind. The implication was clear. Whatever Beerus represented, humanity still needed its protectors. Stock analysts debated in real time whether divine evaluation could be spun as endorsement, while insurance markets began recalculating risk models that had never accounted for planetary judgment. Homelander hovered between the jets and the plaza, addressing them through an open channel that blended command with reassurance, insisting that the situation was under control. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but the pilot's silence in response signaled a shift that he could not immediately correct. Governments were no longer deferring to Vought's internal hierarchy. They were beginning to construct their own. Beerus glanced upward at last, irritation flickering across his features as the noise of engines intruded upon his appraisal. The ambient Chi surged outward in a passive wave that rattled the jet's fuselages and caused their instrument panels to spike with error codes. One aircraft veered off course entirely, its autopilot disengaging without explanation, and only the pilot's manual correction prevented a catastrophic dive into the surrounding buildings. The unintended near-miss forced emergency services to reroute evacuation corridors, and traffic gridlock spread through adjacent districts as civilians attempted to flee a threat they could not see. Government officials moved from observation to mobilization, authorizing ground-based anti-air systems to stand ready in case containment required more than presence. Diplomatic channels continued to broadcast multilingual greetings toward Beerus, but none received acknowledgement. Inside Vought Tower, the decision was made to reposition the 7 away from the crater to a secondary platform, one reinforced for seismic activity rather than spectacle. The relocation was framed as a safety measure for civilians, but in truth, it was an attempt to reestablish a controlled environment where evaluation could be managed. Homelander received the directive and hesitated, because retreat in front of cameras had never been part of his vocabulary. Beerus shifted his stance slightly, and the movement alone caused the crater's edge to crumble inward, swallowing another section of branded backdrop. The passive destruction was not directed at anyone, but it carried the unmistakable message that the environment itself was now subject to his criteria. Wise observed the ripple effect with quiet interest, offering no intervention as the city's infrastructure struggled to adapt. As Homelander descended toward the proposed relocation point, the jets began a wider holding pattern, their presence now a constant reminder that the conflict had expanded beyond corporate management. Vought's containment protocols collided with governmental escalation in a space that neither fully controlled, and the plaza remained the focal point of a judgment no one understood. Above the city, new squadrons were already inbound, their approach vectors intersecting in a tightening net that promised to complicate whatever came next. The decision to relocate the 7 away from the crater did not stabilize the situation so much as spread it, because the moment Beerus turned his attention toward their new platform, the surrounding districts began to feel the same passive distortion that had reduced the original stage to powder. Power substations 3 blocks away tripped simultaneously, their fail-safes reacting to pressure readings that could not exist within any known weather system, and the city's grid began to fragment into isolated pockets of darkness. Emergency broadcasts shifted from evacuation guidance to infrastructure advisories, warning of elevator failures and transit shutdowns that would trap civilians in place rather than move them to safety. Inside residential towers, glass warped just enough to create hairline fractures that multiplied with each passing minute, and office workers who had been instructed to shelter in place felt their desks vibrate against floors that had never before considered movement optional. Hospitals initiated surge protocols not because of injuries, but because patients on ventilators were reporting sudden fluctuations in airflow that could not be traced to mechanical fault. The presence of Beerus was no longer confined to a spectacle zone. It had become a citywide condition that redefined the baseline for normal operation. Homelander landed on the secondary platform with visible restraint, aware that every movement was now being interpreted as either compliance or defiance by institutions that had begun to assert themselves. He signaled for Starlight and Maeve to maintain formation, optics-first behavior persisting, even as the platform's reinforced supports groaned under pressure that had nothing to do with weight. A train paced along the perimeter, testing traction that seemed to vary from step to step, while Black Noir remained motionless in a posture that suggested readiness without understanding. Vought's command center attempted to reframe the relocation as a strategic adjustment, emphasizing civilian safety in their public statements while privately acknowledging that containment had failed. Their analysts began to map the spread of structural anomalies, only to discover that the pattern followed Beerus's line of sight rather than any physical boundary. The implication was devastating. Judgment radiated through attention, not proximity. Government agencies escalated their posture in response, deploying ground units to secure intersections where traffic had stalled into immobility. Armored vehicles rolled into districts that had never seen military presence outside of parades, and their crews reported difficulty maintaining balance as suspension systems compensated for subtle shifts in gravity. Anti-air batteries were activated atop municipal buildings, their targeting arrays struggling to maintain calibration as the ambient high pressure interfered with guidance systems. Wise observed from the edge of the new platform, staff resting lightly against the reinforced surface, offering no commentary as the city adapted in real time to a presence it could not negotiate with. Beerus's expression remained unchanged, his boredom manifesting as a slow escalation of irritation that translated into environmental instability. He watched as Homelander addressed a cluster of emergency responders below, attempting to reassure them that the situation was under control, even as their equipment registered anomalies beyond design limits. Starlight attempted another controlled projection, this time aimed at stabilizing a nearby lighting tower that threatened to collapse onto an evacuation corridor. The beam dispersed before contact, diffused by pressure that did not oppose it so much as ignore it. The tower fell anyway, its descent slowed only by the crowd's earlier retreat, and the resulting dust cloud spread through adjacent streets where civilians were already struggling to navigate blocked routes. Economic indicators began to react with the same volatility as the infrastructure, as trading algorithms interpreted the cascading failures as systemic risk. Vought stock entered a freefall that triggered automated halts, and insurance markets recalculated exposure to include phenomena previously categorized as theoretical. The narrative of heroism gave way to one of liability, and the question shifted from whether the Seven could impress Beerus to whether they could prevent further collapse. Homelander rose again, not to intercept aircraft this time, but to reclaim altitude as a symbol of control, and he positioned himself between Beerus and the densest cluster of high-rises. His posture suggested guardianship, but the ambient pressure bent the air around him into visible ripples that undermined the illusion. He spoke toward Beerus with measured authority, framing the city's instability as a solvable problem if given time and cooperation. Beerus regarded the appeal with mild annoyance, and the passive surge that followed caused a subway line beneath the platform to buckle, trapping a train mid-tunnel. Emergency services rerouted power to maintain ventilation, but the grid's fragmentation made sustained support uncertain. The crisis had expanded beyond spectacle into logistics, and every institution involved now faced decisions that would carry irreversible consequences. Above the skyline, additional military squadrons entered holding patterns, their presence coordinated through channels that had bypassed Vought entirely. The conflict was no longer confined to a plaza or a corporate initiative. It had become a citywide instability that demanded response from systems never designed to account for divine evaluation. As Beerus's attention lingered on the struggling infrastructure, the reinforced platform beneath the Seven began to develop its own network of cracks, promising that relocation had only delayed the inevitable. By the time the reinforced platform began to fracture under Beerus's passive attention, the crisis had already crossed from municipal emergency into national mobilization, because the cascading infrastructure failures could no longer be explained as localized anomalies. Federal agencies that had been observing through Vought's curated feeds now relied on independent satellite telemetry, showing pressure gradients spreading outward from the city in widening, uneven rings. The pattern did not move like weather or seismic activity. It followed Beerus's shifting gaze across districts that had never anticipated being evaluated. Inside Vought International Headquarters, Ashley Barrett found herself coordinating with defense liaisons who had never before acknowledged corporate authority, and the distinction between brand management and civil defense collapsed in real time. Containment Protocol 7 was expanded into a joint framework that included National Guard deployment, not to restrain Beerus, but to maintain order among evacuation corridors that were now failing under gridlock. Legal teams drafted emergency indemnity clauses, while public relations attempted to frame military presence as a cooperative safeguard, rather than a loss of control. Homelander hovered above the secondary platform as convoys of armored vehicles entered adjacent districts, their crews reporting difficulty with navigation systems that drifted off calibration whenever they approached the pressure's edge. He addressed the incoming units over an open channel, asserting that the 7 retained operational authority within the city limits, but the response he received was procedural acknowledgement rather than deference. Governments had begun to treat Beerus as an existential-level threat, and that classification placed Homelander in a role he had never rehearsed. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with emergency responders below, guiding civilians away from structures that had begun to bow inward, as if reconsidering their own integrity. A train attempted short bursts of movement to clear blocked intersections, only to find that traction varied unpredictably under the ambient sky, forcing him to abandon routes mid-sprint. Black Noir remained positioned at the platform's edge, his stillness now less about intimidation and more about conserving balance. Military aircraft established a perimeter beyond the immediate pressure zone, their pilots instructed to avoid direct overflight after multiple reports of lift anomalies. Ground-based anti-air systems were recalibrated to account for atmospheric distortion, though their operators privately questioned the relevance of conventional targeting against a presence that had not yet engaged in directed hostility. Diplomatic teams continued to broadcast multilingual greetings toward Beerus, but every attempt at contact dissolved into static. Wise observed from his usual remove, staff planted lightly against the cracked surface, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without interference. The destroyer's expression remained unchanged, though the subtle flick of his tail coincided with a surge that tripped additional substations across the metropolitan grid. Hospitals switched to backup generators as ventilators struggled to maintain consistent airflow, and transit authorities suspended underground service after a second tunnel reported structural compromise. Economic repercussions followed infrastructure collapse with ruthless efficiency, as trading floors halted activity in sectors tied to urban stability. Insurance markets invoked force majeure clauses that had never contemplated divine evaluation, and supply chains rerouted shipments away from a city that could no longer guarantee structural reliability. The question facing national leadership shifted from whether to contain Beerus to whether evacuation on a metropolitan scale was even feasible under these conditions. Homelander descended toward the platform to confer with Vought's field coordinators, his posture suggesting command even as the ground beneath them developed new fractures. He spoke of cooperation with federal units, framing their presence as an extension of the Seven's mandate, but the language rang hollow against the backdrop of armored columns moving without his authorization. Starlight's comms crackled with reports of civilian panic spreading faster than official guidance could counter. Beerus glanced toward the distant skyline where additional squadrons assembled, irritation registering as a faint tightening around his eyes. The passive surge that followed caused a communications tower to tilt several degrees off plumb, its signal degrading across emergency bands. Evacuation routes dependent on coordinated traffic control faltered as lights defaulted to fail-safe red, trapping convoys in intersections that had become choke points. Government officials authorized the deployment of heavy engineering units to reinforce critical bridges, though their arrival times were now uncertain under gridlock conditions. The mobilization had become a race against environmental instability, with each institution attempting to maintain function in a system that no longer recognized their parameters. Above the platform, Homelander rose once more, positioning himself between Beerus and the densest civilian clusters in a gesture that blended guardianship with defiance. As additional National Guard units entered the city, their presence layered new complexity onto an already strained response, and the conflict expanded beyond spectacle into coordinated national effort. Beerus's attention lingered on the mobilization with mild annoyance, and the reinforced platform beneath the Seven gave way along a fresh seam, promising that even their fallback positions were temporary at best. When the reinforced platform finally sheared along its newest fracture line, it did more than force the Seven into an emergency hover and retreat, because the live footage of their fallback position collapsing under Beerus's passive presence triggered an international response that no corporate protocol could delay. Foreign governments that had been monitoring the national mobilization shifted from advisory posture to active contingency planning, rerouting air traffic away from the pressure zone and placing rapid deployment units on standby. The classification of Beerus as an existential-level threat was no longer confined to a single nation's internal memos. It was now a shared designation across defense alliances that had not coordinated this quickly in decades. Inside Vought International Headquarters, the realization that jurisdiction had gone global forced a strategic pivot from containment to negotiation, even though no channel of communication had proven viable. Ashley Barrett found herself on simultaneous calls with international regulators, demanding assurance that the evaluation would not expand beyond urban limits, while legal teams drafted cross-border indemnity agreements that assumed damage would not respect national boundaries. Marketing attempted one final reframing, describing Beerus's presence as a planetary audit that could validate global reliance on Supes, but the phrase was drowned out by footage of subway tunnels buckling and communications towers tilting under invisible pressure. Homelander rose above the fractured remains of the secondary platform, aware that the optics of retreat were now being broadcast on networks he did not control. He addressed an incoming multinational task force over an open channel, asserting that the Seven remained the primary line of defense, but the response he received was procedural acknowledgement rather than endorsement. Fighter squadrons from allied nations established holding patterns beyond the immediate distortion field, their pilots instructed to maintain distance after reports of lift anomalies circulated through shared intelligence feeds. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with emergency responders, attempting to reroute evacuation convoys through districts where traffic signals had defaulted to fail-safe red, while A-Train abandoned acceleration entirely after a near fall that sent him skidding across a surface that could not decide whether to offer friction. Black Noir repositioned along the crater's edge, his stillness now a concession to balance rather than intimidation. The Seven maintained formation out of habit, interpreting evaluation as performance even as the environment refused to cooperate. Wise observed from his customary remove, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without intervention. The destroyer's attention shifted toward the distant skyline where additional aircraft assembled, irritation registering as a subtle tightening that translated into a surge across the pressure gradient. Hospitals in outlying districts reported simultaneous generator failures as backup systems struggled against fluctuating load, and emergency planners began to consider the possibility that evacuation corridors could extend beyond metropolitan limits. International markets reacted with synchronized volatility, as shipping insurers suspended coverage for routes passing within the expanding anomaly zone. Supply chains rerouted shipments away from ports that could no longer guarantee structural integrity, and energy grids in neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should the city's demand collapse entirely. The conflict had evolved from a question of urban stability into one of global logistics, with every institution recalculating risk against a presence that had not yet engaged in directed hostility. Homelander descended briefly to confer with Vought's field coordinators, his posture suggesting command even as multinational units established checkpoints without his authorization. He spoke of cooperation, framing the task forces as extensions of the Seven's mandate, but the language carried less weight against armored columns bearing foreign insignia. Starlight's comms crackled with reports of civilian panic spreading across borders, fueled by live feeds that no single network could suppress. Beerus glanced toward the incoming formations, boredom giving way to faint annoyance at the noise and motion intruding upon his appraisal. The passive surge that followed caused a distant bridge to sag several inches along its span, forcing an evacuation convoy to halt mid-crossing. Engineering units scrambled to reinforce the structure, but their arrival times were now uncertain under gridlock that extended into neighboring states. Diplomatic channels continued to broadcast multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static, as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying heavy engineering units and medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. Above the skyline, the multinational squadrons tightened their holding patterns, their presence a constant reminder that the evaluation had become an international concern. As Beerus's attention lingered on the mobilization with mild irritation, the crater's edge expanded outward, swallowing another section of plaza and sending debris into adjacent streets. The Seven adjusted formation once more, maintaining optics in a space that no longer respected structure, while the global escalation moved from contingency to implementation. The moment the crater's edge consumed the last intact segment of the original plaza, the illusion that this was still a managed evaluation dissolved for everyone except Homelander, who continued to interpret silence from Beerus as a refusal to acknowledge rightful hierarchy. The multinational holding patterns above the skyline tightened further, and ground-based units from 3 separate defense coalitions established overlapping checkpoints in districts that had never coordinated even during natural disasters. What had begun as a publicity validation for Vought International was now an active resistance posture against a presence that had not issued a single demand. Beerus did not attack, and that absence of directed hostility forced every institution involved to improvise justification for continued escalation. The ambient chi pressure remained steady but oppressive, bending antenna arrays and causing the upper floors of nearby towers to sway by fractions that engineers could not correct. Civilians sheltering in underground stations reported nausea and disorientation, while emergency services struggled to maintain communications through bands that drifted out of calibration whenever Beerus shifted his attention. The Seven reformed along the crater's perimeter, optics-first behavior persisting even as the environment undermined their footing. Starlight coordinated with responders, attempting to stabilize an evacuation corridor that had become impassable after a communications mast tilted into the roadway, while Maeve anchored a line of civilians moving toward a temporary shelter. A train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight, and Black Noir's stillness now read as adaptation rather than intimidation. Homelander rose into the air once more, positioning himself directly between Beerus and the densest cluster of multinational units. He addressed the assembled forces over an open channel, asserting that the Seven would handle the evaluation internally, and that further mobilization risked provoking unnecessary instability. The statement was intended as reassurance, but the procedural silence that followed signaled a shift from deference to parallel authority. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff planted lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's gaze moved across the overlapping lines of resistance, and the subtle irritation that registered translated into a passive surge that rattled armored vehicles in place. One convoy reported simultaneous sensor failure, forcing crews to rely on visual cues in an environment where depth perception had become unreliable. International planners authorized the deployment of heavy engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that resistance would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and energy grids in neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The conflict had evolved from spectacle into coordinated resistance, with institutions attempting to maintain function under judgment they did not understand. Homelander descended briefly to confer with Vought's field coordinators, his posture suggesting command even as multinational checkpoints operated without his authorization. He spoke of cooperation, framing the assembled units as extensions of the Seven's mandate, but the language carried less weight against armored columns bearing foreign insignia. Starlight's comms crackled with reports of civilian panic spreading into adjacent states, fueled by live feeds that no single network could suppress. Beerus's attention lingered on the resistance with mild annoyance, and the passive surge that followed caused a distant overpass to sag along its span, forcing an evacuation convoy to halt mid-crossing. Engineering teams scrambled to reinforce the structure, but their arrival times were now uncertain under gridlock that extended beyond city limits. The Seven adjusted formation once more, maintaining performance in a space that no longer respected structure. Above the skyline, multinational squadrons shifted from observation to readiness, their targeting arrays recalibrated against atmospheric distortion that continued to interfere with guidance systems. Diplomatic channels persisted in broadcasting multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. As Beerus's gaze moved toward the overlapping lines of resistance, the crater expanded again, swallowing a section of roadway and sending debris into adjacent districts. Homelander rose to meet the shift, positioning himself as a barrier between the destroyer and the assembled units, while the multinational presence tightened its perimeter in anticipation of further escalation already in motion. The moment Homelander positioned himself directly between Beerus and the multinational perimeter, the nature of the resistance changed from institutional to personal, because what had been framed as coordinated containment was now interpreted by the Seven as a challenge to their place in the hierarchy. The holding patterns above the skyline tightened again, and the ground units below shifted their formations to account for a potential clash that none of their briefings had prepared them to witness. What had begun as a corporate validation exercise for Vought International had become a test of whether authority could be asserted against a judgment that had not yet spoken. Beerus regarded Homelander's hovering stance with the same detached curiosity he had shown the original handshake, but the ambient Chi pressure intensified as his attention lingered. Armored vehicles at the perimeter reported simultaneous suspension failures, their chassis dipping unevenly as the ground beneath them reconsidered its cohesion. Civilians sheltering in adjacent districts felt a sudden shift in balance, and emergency services struggled to maintain order as evacuation routes became unreliable. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with responders attempting to stabilize a bridge that had begun to sag under the passive surge, while A-Train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight. Black Noir repositioned along the crater's edge, his stillness now a concession to balance rather than intimidation. The seven maintained formation out of habit, interpreting evaluation as performance even as the environment refused to cooperate. Homelander addressed Beerus directly, his voice carrying through open channels to multinational units that had begun to recalibrate their posture. He spoke of protection, of necessity, framing his presence as the barrier between civilization and collapse, but the words hung in the air without apparent effect. The silence that followed was interpreted by him as dismissal rather than neutrality, and his posture shifted from assurance to challenge. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's gaze moved across the assembled resistance, and the subtle irritation that registered translated into a passive surge that rattled nearby structures. A communications tower several blocks away tilted further off plumb, degrading emergency bands that evacuation planners relied upon. International planners authorized additional deployment of engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that defiance would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and energy grids in neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The conflict had evolved from coordinated resistance into a question of whether individual assertion could alter judgment. Homelander rose higher, positioning himself as a visible barrier between Beerus and the densest civilian clusters, and his eyes ignited with restrained intensity. The heat vision he released was not aimed at Beerus directly, but carved a warning arc across the sky, a demonstration intended to reclaim narrative control. The redirected energy sheared through an unoccupied industrial crane, collapsing it into the street below and sending debris into an evacuation corridor that had only just been cleared. The unintended destruction forced emergency services to reroute again, and the multinational perimeter adjusted to account for new choke points. Beerus's expression tightened fractionally, boredom giving way to irritation at the noise and motion intruding upon his appraisal. The passive surge that followed caused the crater's edge to expand outward, swallowing another section of roadway and sending a shock through adjacent districts. Diplomatic channels persisted in broadcasting multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static, as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. Above the skyline, multinational squadrons shifted from observation to readiness, their targeting arrays recalibrated against atmospheric distortion. As Homelander maintained his position, the ground beneath the multinational units developed new fractures, forcing armored vehicles to reposition under unstable conditions. The seven adjusted formation once more, maintaining optics in a space that no longer respected structure, while Beerus's attention lingered on the defiance with mild annoyance that promised further escalation already in motion. The industrial crane that collapsed under Homelander's redirected warning arc had not yet finished settling when the multinational perimeter began to report simultaneous instrument failure, because Beerus's attention had shifted from resistance to assessment. What had been interpreted as patience now registered as evaluation, and the ambient high pressure across the city stabilized into something more focused, as though the environment itself had been placed on a scale. Beerus did not move immediately, and that stillness forced every institution involved to confront the possibility that escalation had never been the point. Armored vehicles along the perimeter reported that their onboard systems were cycling through diagnostics without command input, while emergency services found their communications bands narrowing into a usable range that did not include diplomatic outreach. Civilians sheltering in underground stations felt a sudden clarity in the air, as though the oppressive weight had condensed rather than lifted. The seven reformed along the crater's edge, optics-first behavior persisting even as the ground beneath them developed a new network of fractures. Starlight coordinated with responders attempting to maintain an evacuation corridor that now threaded through districts where gravity felt uneven, while Maeve anchored a line of civilians moving toward a temporary shelter. A train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight, and Black Noir's stillness now read as adaptation rather than intimidation. Homelander hovered at the forefront, his posture suggesting guardianship even as the multinational units behind him adjusted their formations. He addressed Beerus once more, framing his presence as the necessary barrier between civilization and collapse, but the words carried less conviction against the silence that followed. The absence of response was interpreted by him as a challenge, and his stance shifted from assurance to hostility. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's gaze moved across the assembled resistance, and the subtle irritation that registered translated into a passive surge that rattled nearby structures. A distant overpass sagged further along its span, forcing an evacuation convoy to halt mid-crossing. International planners authorized additional deployment of engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that judgment would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and energy grids in neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The conflict had evolved from defiance into an appraisal that no one understood how to influence. Beerus raised one hand, not in anger but in consideration, and the motion alone caused the air to distort visibly around his fingertips. Multinational squadrons above the skyline reported sudden turbulence despite clear weather, and ground units felt their balance shift as though the planet itself had been nudged. Homelander rose to meet the gesture, positioning himself directly within the line of sight, his eyes igniting with restrained intensity. The heat vision he released this time was aimed closer, not as an attack, but as a demonstration that he would not yield position. The beams bent before reaching Beerus, refracted into harmless arcs that carved through an unoccupied parking structure and sent debris cascading into adjacent streets. Emergency services rerouted again, their plans unraveling under the cumulative effect of unintended consequences. Beerus's expression tightened fractionally, boredom giving way to irritation at the continued performance intruding upon his appraisal. The passive surge that followed caused the crater's edge to expand outward once more, swallowing a section of roadway and sending a shock through adjacent districts. The Seven adjusted formation, maintaining optics in a space that no longer respected structure. Diplomatic channels persisted in broadcasting multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. Above the skyline, multinational squadrons shifted from readiness to contingency, their targeting arrays recalibrated against atmospheric distortion. As Beerus's hand remained raised, the ground beneath the multinational units developed new fractures, forcing armored vehicles to reposition under unstable conditions. Homelander maintained his position, interpreting the gesture as a prelude to confrontation, while the ambient pressure condensed into a focused field that promised irreversible consequences already in motion. By the time Beerus's raised hand had remained suspended for more than a few seconds, the multinational task forces understood that whatever followed would not be contained by city limits, because the atmospheric data they were receiving showed pressure anomalies extending beyond the metropolitan grid into surrounding states. What had begun as localized instability now registered as a continental disturbance, and international defense alliances initiated contingency plans that had previously existed only in simulations for asteroid impact or nuclear exchange. Inside Vought International Headquarters, crisis teams shifted from urban liability modeling to planetary risk assessment, coordinating with global regulators who demanded assurances that no further escalation would occur. Financial markets suspended trading in sectors tied to infrastructure resilience, and energy grids across neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The narrative had moved from corporate miscalculation to planetary stakes, with every institution recalibrating against the possibility that Beerus's judgment could extend beyond human control. Homelander remained positioned within Beerus's line of sight, his posture blending guardianship with challenge as multinational units behind him adjusted their formations. He addressed the assembled forces over an open channel, asserting that the Seven would prevent any further spread of instability, but the procedural acknowledgement he received signaled a shift from reliance to parallel authority. Fighter squadrons above the skyline reported sudden turbulence despite clear weather, their flight paths adjusting to compensate for lift anomalies that followed Beerus's gaze. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with emergency responders, attempting to maintain evacuation corridors that now threaded through districts where gravity felt uneven, while A-Train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight. Black Noir repositioned along the crater's edge, his stillness now a concession to balance rather than intimidation. The Seven maintained formation out of habit, interpreting evaluation as performance even as the environment refused to cooperate. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's attention shifted toward the distant horizon, where additional multinational units assembled, irritation registering as a subtle tightening that translated into a passive surge across the pressure gradient. Hospitals in outlying districts reported simultaneous generator failures as backup systems struggled against fluctuating load, and emergency planners began to consider evacuation corridors that extended beyond national borders. International planners authorized the deployment of heavy engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that planetary stakes would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and shipping insurers suspended coverage for routes passing within the expanding disturbance field. The conflict had evolved from resistance into a question of whether planetary stability could be maintained under judgment. Homelander rose higher, positioning himself as a visible barrier between Beerus and the densest civilian clusters, and his eyes ignited with restrained intensity. The heat vision he released carved a warning arc across the sky, intended to reclaim narrative control, but the redirected energy sheared through an unoccupied industrial complex and sent debris into an evacuation corridor that had only just been cleared. Emergency services rerouted again, their plans unraveling under the cumulative effect of unintended consequences. Beerus's expression tightened fractionally, boredom giving way to irritation at the continued performance intruding upon his appraisal. The passive surge that followed caused a distant suspension bridge to sag along its span, forcing an evacuation convoy to halt mid-crossing. Engineering teams scrambled to reinforce the structure, but their arrival times were now uncertain under gridlock that extended into neighboring states. Diplomatic channels persisted in broadcasting multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static, as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. Above the skyline, multinational squadrons shifted from contingency to readiness, their targeting arrays recalibrated against atmospheric distortion. As Beerus's hand remained raised, the ground beneath the multinational units developed new fractures, forcing armored vehicles to reposition under unstable conditions. Homelander maintained his position, interpreting the gesture as a prelude to confrontation, while the ambient pressure condensed into a focused field that promised planetary consequences already in motion. The first regional power grid to fail was not the one closest to the crater, but the one tied into a network of redundancies 3 states away. And that was when international planners understood that Beerus's raised hand had begun to influence systems far beyond the immediate disturbance zone. What had been classified as a metropolitan instability now registered as cascading infrastructure collapse across a continental scale, forcing emergency declarations in regions that had not yet felt the ambient pressure directly. Hospitals switched to manual ventilation protocols as backup generators cycled unpredictably, and evacuation corridors that extended beyond national borders became choke points under sudden gridlock. Inside Vought International headquarters, crisis teams abandoned urban liability modeling in favor of planetary risk assessment, coordinating with global regulators who demanded assurance that further escalation would not occur. Financial markets suspended trading in sectors tied to infrastructure resilience, and energy grids across neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The narrative had moved beyond corporate miscalculation into irreversible loss, with every institution recalibrating against the possibility that Beerus's judgment could not be deferred. Homelander remained positioned within Beerus's line of sight, his posture blending guardianship with hostility as multinational units behind him adjusted their formations. He addressed the assembled forces over an open channel, asserting that the 7 would prevent further spread of instability, but the procedural acknowledgement he received signaled a shift from reliance to parallel authority. Fighter squadrons above the skyline reported sudden turbulence despite clear weather, their flight paths adjusting to compensate for lift anomalies that followed Beerus's gaze. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with emergency responders, attempting to maintain evacuation corridors that now threaded through districts where gravity felt uneven, while A-Train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight. Black Noir repositioned along the crater's edge, his stillness now a concession to balance rather than intimidation. The 7 maintained formation out of habit, interpreting evaluation as performance even as the environment refused to cooperate. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's attention shifted toward the distant horizon, where additional multinational units assembled, irritation registering as a subtle tightening that translated into a passive surge across the pressure gradient. A suspension bridge in an outlying state sagged beyond its tolerances and collapsed mid-evacuation, sending vehicles into a river that rescue teams could not reach under current conditions. International planners authorized the deployment of heavy engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that planetary stakes would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and shipping insurers suspended coverage for routes passing within the expanding disturbance field. The conflict had evolved from resistance into a scenario where loss could not be reversed by conventional means. Homelander rose higher, positioning himself as a visible barrier between Beerus and the densest civilian clusters, and his eyes ignited with restrained intensity. The heat vision he released carved another warning arc across the sky, intended to reclaim narrative control, but the redirected energy sheared through an unoccupied refinery and ignited a secondary fire that spread through adjacent storage tanks. Emergency services rerouted again, their plans unraveling under the cumulative effect of unintended consequences. Beerus's expression tightened fractionally, boredom giving way to irritation at the continued performance intruding upon his appraisal. The passive surge that followed caused the crater's edge to expand outward once more, swallowing a section of roadway and sending a shock through adjacent districts. The 7 adjusted formation, maintaining optics in a space that no longer respected structure. Diplomatic channels persisted in broadcasting multilingual greetings toward Beerus, each message dissolving into static, as though the signal itself were being judged and dismissed. Governments authorized additional mobilization, deploying medical teams to staging areas beyond the pressure's reach. Above the skyline, multinational squadrons shifted from readiness to contingency, their targeting arrays recalibrated against atmospheric distortion. As Beerus's hand remained raised, the ground beneath the multinational units developed new fractures, forcing armored vehicles to reposition under unstable conditions. Homelander maintained his position, interpreting the gesture as a prelude to confrontation, while the ambient pressure condensed into a focused field that signaled losses already beyond recovery. The suspension bridge that collapsed mid-evacuation was still burning when Beerus finally lowered his hand by a fraction, and the movement did not release the pressure so much as refine it into something precise. What had been ambient instability condensed into a field that no longer spread randomly through infrastructure, but instead gathered along fault lines that had never existed on any geological survey. Governments monitoring continental telemetry saw the shift instantly, because seismic arrays began reporting stress concentrations beneath the very districts where Vought International had staged their original demonstration. Homelander remained suspended within Beerus's line of sight, his posture no longer blending guardianship with assurance, but hardening into outright defiance as multinational units behind him recalibrated their formations. He spoke again, invoking protection and necessity, but the words carried less conviction against the silence that followed. Fighter squadrons above the skyline reported sudden turbulence despite clear weather, their flight paths adjusting to compensate for lift anomalies that now followed Beerus's focus with deliberate intent. Starlight and Maeve coordinated with emergency responders, attempting to maintain evacuation corridors that had become impassable under uneven gravity, while A-Train remained grounded, testing each step before committing weight. Black Noir repositioned along the crater's edge, his stillness now a concession to balance rather than intimidation. The seven maintained formation out of habit, interpreting evaluation as performance even as the environment refused to cooperate. Wise observed from a short distance away, staff resting lightly against fractured stone, allowing Beerus to determine planetary worth without commentary. The destroyer's gaze moved across the assembled resistance, irritation registering as a subtle tightening that translated into a passive surge across the pressure gradient. A communications tower in an adjacent state tilted beyond recovery, degrading emergency bands that evacuation planners relied upon. International planners authorized the deployment of heavy engineering units to reinforce critical infrastructure beyond the immediate anomaly zone, anticipating that the final verdict would require sustained logistics. Supply chains rerouted shipments through secondary ports, and energy grids across neighboring regions prepared for load redistribution should metropolitan demand collapse entirely. The conflict had evolved from resistance into a question of whether any structure could remain under judgment. Beerus extended a single finger, not in anger but in decision, and the air around it shimmered with a containment that suggested consequence rather than spectacle. Homelander rose to meet the gesture, positioning himself directly within the line of sight, his eyes igniting with restrained intensity as he attempted one last demonstration of indispensability. The heat vision he released bent before reaching Beerus, refracted into harmless arcs that carved through an unoccupied industrial block and sent debris cascading into streets that had already been cleared. Beerus's expression did not change, and the motion of his finger continued, slow and deliberate, until the focused field settled beneath the original plaza's coordinates. The ground there did not explode. It ceased to maintain cohesion, collapsing inward as though a layer of reality had been quietly removed. Structures along the perimeter followed, their foundations dissolving into absence that did not burn or shatter but simply refused to exist. Multinational units reported simultaneous loss of footing, as the affected district dropped several meters in a controlled subsidence that spread outward in concentric rings. Emergency services attempted to reroute, but evacuation corridors that had been mapped minutes earlier now terminated in voids where roadways had been. The seven adjusted formation instinctively, but the platform they had retreated to no longer had a stable reference point. Homelander hovered above the expanding absence, interpreting the gesture as a challenge until the air beneath him thinned into something that did not support lift. He corrected instinctively, but the recalibration came too late to maintain altitude over a district that had been quietly judged unnecessary. Starlight reached for a responder whose footing had vanished, while Maeve anchored a line that no longer had a destination. Beerus withdrew his hand. The irritation that had replaced boredom now resolved into indifference as the subsidence stabilized into a new topography. Wise inclined his head slightly, acknowledging a decision rendered without spectacle. Diplomatic channels continued to broadcast greetings that dissolved into static, and multinational squadrons shifted from readiness to withdrawal as targeting arrays lost reference points. The city did not return to normal, because the district that had housed Vought's demonstration was now a basin where infrastructure could not be rebuilt under altered conditions. Governments recalculated evacuation plans against a landscape that had been permanently changed, and financial markets reopened into a reality where planetary judgment had become a precedent rather than a rumor. Beerus turned away from the absence, his attention already drifting toward concerns that did not include human stakes, while the seven maintained formation over a void that had replaced their stage. The world had been evaluated, and the verdict had reshaped it beyond restoration.